Okay. All right, we are officially up and running on YouTube. It's been a little bit, how was it, the learning curve? Todd, were you doing things on Zoom before the pandemic?
Nope, never.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, our nonprofit is the Veterans Breakfast Club, and we do veteran storytelling programs. We did them all in person, and then with the pandemic, we moved to Zoom. So it was a very steep learning curve, but it's been so wonderful being able to do these programs on Zoom and reach veterans across the country.
Absolutely. We've also noticed, even when, we've gone back to a lot of in-person programs too, but especially in the winter, like people don't want to come out really as much. So it's really nice to have these online stuff in the colder months.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right. Well, welcome to everybody, and thank you for coming out to tonight's program. We are very excited to have Todd DePastino.
You got it.
All right. Very nice. He is author of the book Citizen Hobo, How a Century of Homelessness Shaped America. We, of course, if you don't know, we are having him out tonight because of our One Book, One Community program. So we are asking our entire community to read this book, This Tender Land by William Kent Kruger. It is the story of 4 orphans, and it takes place during the Great Depression. We are also having William out on February 16th at 7 p.m. at the Prairie Center for the Arts. There will be appetizers. There will be a cash bar. There will be book signings. So if you have not yet signed up for that, please go online and do that. You can either do it online or in person. So now I would like to introduce the wonderful Todd, and we are so excited to hear about your program. So take it away.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Thank you very much for coming and listening to this talk about the American hobo. It's not a talk I give very often. I'm especially grateful. I was joking with Stephanie that I think the reason why I was invited is because people who live around the Chicago area know what a hobo is. I'm in Pittsburgh. There weren't many hobos here. So it was, we'll see that your region has a special connection to this subject. And my connection is that I wrote my first book about this hobo world. It's called Citizen Hobo, How a Century of Homelessness Shaped America. And that was followed up by a book that I reissued with a long introduction and annotation by the wonderful Jack London called The Road, which was about the months that he spent at age 18 in the 1890s traveling the country by rail, and wrote about it. He was one of the first, and I'll talk about him in a little bit. Most of the time when I'm asked to give a talk, it's about this book. This was my follow-up book to Citizen Hobo. This is Bill Mauldin, A Life Up Front. Some of you might be old enough to know who Bill Mauldin was. He was a rifleman in the 45th Infantry Division, and he was plucked from the infantry and put on Stars and Stripes because he was a cartoonist, and he did grim, realistic cartoons of the life up front or the life in the foxholes. His 2 cartoon characters were Willie and Joe, and they kind of showed the home front, some of the grimmer realities of war, much like the great Ernie Pyle showed them in writing. And people have often asked, like, how did you follow up a book about hobos with a book about Bill Mauldin? And I liked to show these 2 pictures. I think this shows the immediate family connection between hobos and Willie and Joe. You could see absolutely. I remember my wife's uncle, World War II veteran. I was talking to him about the Mauldin book, and he said, "Oh yeah, Willie and Joe were just hobos in olive drab." He said, I served with hobos. They were drafted too. And here's another great kind of a couple photos that show how Bill Mauldin, the youngest Pulitzer Prize winner in history, still is. Of course, you guys are from the Chicagoland area. He cartooned for the Sun-Times. You know who he was. You can see right here that Mauldin really, copied Weary Willie, Emmett Kelly's famous character. When Mauldin did this cartoon, when he started doing Willie and Joe in, say, 1943, this iteration of Willie and Joe, the tramp and the hobo was a well-established figure on the American landscape. I mean, tramps and hobos had been around for 80 years since the Civil War. Nobody imagined that they would ever disappear. And they were the most commonly depicted characters in American popular culture during these years. And no one knew, including Malden, that shortly after Malden did this cartoons, Tramps and Hobos, the era of the Tramps and Hobos would come to an end, and it would be the war that ended it. Now, tramping from job to job was a very much a tradition in American life going back to the colonial period. Whether you were a butcher, a baker, or a candlestick maker, no matter what your trade was, you would put some time in as an apprentice, and that usually lasted 6 or 7 years, where you would learn the art and mystery of the trade. You'd learn from a master who owned the shop and who used your labor, but also in exchange for your labor would teach you the craft. And then you would graduate and you would go on, you would become a journeyman. That's what it was called. You would go on the road and hit the road, and you would then expose yourself to different shops and different, other masters who may have slightly different techniques, and you'd learn a little bit about the country. You'd learn a little bit about the variety of your field. You'd earn some money for the first time. You'd earn wages. This was a big deal. You'd earn wages. You'd save up those wages. And the whole idea is your knowledge base would increase as your savings rate would increase. And when they hit the right point, you would settle down, open your own shop, and become a master yourself. That was the idea. That was the economic foundation upon which our country was founded. I mean, that was the Jeffersonian era of, the yeoman farmer, of white men being overwhelmingly self-employed, mostly as farmers, but also as tradesmen. It was a very, very common kind of stage in life. But the whole idea was wages and journeying was a stage in the life cycle. If you were 30 years old, this is Abraham Lincoln, this idea existed up to Lincoln's day. If you were 30 years old and still working for wages, you were a loser. You were a failure in life. The idea was to become a self-supporting proprietor, a shop owner, somebody who owned property on their own. And here's some great photos of a very well-known person who went through these stages of development. On the upper left, you see young Samuel Clemens, 12 years old, apprenticed to his brother, Hannibal, Missouri, as a typesetter. He does his apprenticeship over 6 years. By age 18, he's becomes a journeyman. He goes to New York City, goes to Philadelphia, Cincinnati, St. Louis, sees the world, learns the art and mystery of the trade even more, and then ends up becoming this a well-known writer. And it was Mark Twain. By the time Samuel Clemens had become Mark Twain gave the term to the age in which he was living, which we call the Gilded Age. And Mark Twain came up with that. And it was the Gilded Age that, when this world of the journeyman, the Jeffersonian world of the small proprietor, began to break down. And it began to break down because shops were getting bigger, very big, now employing hundreds or even thousands of people and serving not local markets, but regional and even national markets. A new financial instrument, or a legal instrument called the corporation, was expanding and being used to create very large concerns, so that no journeyman, no matter how long you were on the road, no matter how long you were earning wages, were ever going to come up with enough wages to compete with the large, you could call them factories, the large shops. And so the era of the small shops, the master craftsmen, was swept aside by this new mass industrial age. And it was during this new period, it was a wrenching transition, because it wrenched apart the workplace from the home. Before the Civil War, most Americans lived and worked in the same place, or they close to the same place. And but with this kind of industrialization, home and work became separate. You now had to rent a space to live, And because most people had to walk to work, when you lost your job, it meant that you had to move. So losing your job, and there had always been slack times, there had always been down times in the economy, but because people owned, productive property, they would get by usually during the down times. But now, when you lost your job, it meant you lost your wages, and it also meant you lost where you were living. So for the first time, a word had to be created to describe this phenomenon. The word unemployment had not existed until 1887 because it just was not the kind of crisis that it became during the Gilded Age. And as unemployment became a problem during real depressions, and there were three big depressions between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century. Some economists call it a single long depression, lasted about 24 years or so, between the 1870s and 1890s. During this time, when there was crashes in the economy, it seemed like the whole country was out on the road, kind of moving and looking for a new job. And those who tended to travel furthest afield to look for new wage labor were called tramps. The word tramp had existed. It first came into the English language to describe a kind of invigorating walk into the countryside. Soldiers in the Civil War began using it. In fact, there was a song, Tramp, 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 that kind of satirized this older use of the idea of tramp, that instead of a invigorating walk into the nature, you were having a grueling march to battle. After the Civil War, during the 1870s, in 1873, the word tramp then was used again sardonically to refer to this grueling now walk in search of work. And then it finally became attached to individuals for the first time in 1873. Word spread by the 1890s that you can get good, high-paying jobs out west, building, harvesting, mining. You had thousands and thousands of people flocking to the west to kind of work in the coal and copper mines, to build the railroads and towns, to create the infrastructure of the west, to work the timber fields, doing all the harvesting of wheat and corn. That was done by laborers who would travel west for these jobs. And the pay was good, but there was a catch, and that is they were temporary. These jobs were temporary. They would only last a few weeks or months if you were lucky. And then at the end of your term, you would go back and have to find another one. So in the West, the job sites were so widespread, so far apart from one another, that to travel and in search of these jobs, you really need to ride a train. And those who were daring enough to climb aboard those freight trains illegally, although they didn't see it as illegal. I remember reading about a hobo in Chicago being interviewed, and that social reformer who was interviewing him on the streets, West Madison Street in Chicago, asked him something like, "Don't you feel guilty about stealing rides on a freight train from the railroad company?" And this hobo looked at this woman like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Riding a freight train is an inalienable right. It's in the Constitution." So, I mean, they absolutely saw that this was absolutely a necessity of their work, a necessity of their way of life. If they were going to go pursue these jobs out west, they had to bum a ride, on a freight train to get there and to get back. Now, these people, these aggressive, rail riding, highly mobile, assertive, independent Western workers came to be called hobos by the 1890s. I would love to be able to tell you where the word hobo came from. I've never found out. I've heard every theory that you could come up with. Hello boy, ho boy, hote boy, hello bo, hobo, homo bonus, good man. uh, Houston and Bowery, which was a street corner in New York City, that has stood for homeless body, hopping body. None of these, I'm not buying any of these. None of them ring true. I do know that the word was first used in print. In my book, I say that the first use of the word hobo in print is Kansas City Star, 1888. A few years ago, a very kind reader sent me an email and said, I found an earlier use 3 years earlier in the St. Paul Globe, the hobo, the worker. So you could see how the word is used here. It's assuming that the readers know what a hobo is. So the word is in circulation as early as 1885, but I don't know the origin of it, and I've never found a convincing argument for where the word came from. But it absolutely was used in the West and then spread east from there. The first person to write about the hobo and the hobo world and the methods of the hobo was this Westerner, Jack London. When Jack was 18 years old, on April 6th, 1894, he snuck into the Union Pacific Rail Yard in Oakland, California, and he hopped aboard this train, the Overland Limited. And he enjoyed enjoyed is not the right word. He went on a 10,000-mile excursion across North America and back. It took him 6 months. It included 90 days in the Erie County Penitentiary for the charge of tramp. And he returned to Oakland in late 1894, a changed man. Absolutely. It hadn't broken him at all, but it had convinced him of two things. Number one, he would not work with his hands or his body anymore. He was going to become a brain worker. He saw his exposure to work across the country, saw that manual labor, you end up living a miserable life and dying young. He was not going to do that. He did end up dying young, but he was going to become a brain worker, use his brain. Number two, that trip convinced him that capitalism was rotten, needed to be overthrown, and he became a committed socialist for the rest of his life. But what he did is he wrote about in The Road, in the series of articles that were first published in magazines and then collected together in a book. He wrote about what it's like and how to ride a train. Now, you have to understand, Jack London, he always had to be, the best at everything. So he refused on principle to catch rides on freight trains. He claims, rode passenger trains because passenger trains were more challenging. Yard bulls or railroad yard police would allow you to catch a freight train and without much trouble, he said. But yard bulls, yard police never wanted anybody to ride a passenger train because they scared the passengers who were paying good money for these trains. Jack London wanted to ride passenger trains because they were faster, much faster. Today, not to get into the details, but today with our rail system in the United States, freight has priority over passenger rail travel. That's why most sections of the country, passenger rail travel is pretty slow. But in Jack London's day and until the late 20th century, it was just the opposite. Freight train or passenger trains had the priority, so they were much, much faster. So this was a sport for Jack London. And he described how, you would sneak into a yard and you would wait for a train to begin pulling out. And you had to wait for just the right moment because the train had to be going fast enough that a yard bull is going to try and tackle you, or too fast for a yard bull to try and get you, but not so fast that when you grab that handrail, it wouldn't, pull your arm out of your socket or throw you underneath the train. And then once you grab that handrail and you boarded the train, now the trick was to figure out where to ride it out. You could go up on top. That was called decking the train, riding the deck. You had to watch your head in tunnels, and it was sometimes hard to hold on, but it was often a place where, again, the railroad police weren't going to try and, evict you from up there. They might not even see you. Another option would go below the train. This was, believe it or not, this was considered a safe place to be, safer than the roof, in those wheel trucks underneath the train, underneath the car. inches away from the whizzing gravel and ties beneath you. It just makes me shiver head to toe thinking about what it must have been like to be stuck in there, speeding along those rails. But that was considered a good place to be. London, if he could, like to travel between the trains there, and especially the kind of really high value place was on the platform behind the baggage car, which it was called the blind baggage. It was often called. That's what hobos called it, because there wasn't a door leading out of the baggage car. So if you get to the blind, and the railroad police, the conductor was always kind of trying to watch the blind and make sure nobody was out there. But that was a good place to ride it out. This world that London is describing, and here the easy way to ride a train was the freight train. This is, you just hop aboard. Most of the time, it depended on the yard, depended on the time, depended on the economy, depended on the railroad. It depended if there had been any thefts from freight trains. But most of the time, railroads were pretty tolerant of people riding freight trains between 1870 and, say, World War II. This whole world that Jack London did so well to describe, to depict for very interested readers in the 1890s. This was a world unto itself. It was a homeless world unto itself. The word homelessness doesn't come about until the 20th century. It's not there when Jack London is writing, but it was, I think, what would come to be known as a homeless world. But homelessness in the 1890s, 1900s, on the eve of World War I, after World War I, homelessness in the years before World War II was not the homelessness we think of today. It was different, profoundly different in three major ways. Number one, the homeless world of the early 20th century was overwhelmingly young, white, and male. Specifically English-speaking, native-born English-speaking male. Very few African Americans, very few Mexican Americans or Asians or Southern and Eastern European immigrants, even very few women on the road. All these people did travel, they did migrate, and they worked the same jobs right next to the hobos. They worked in the same mines, they worked in the same harvest fields, they worked building the same railroads right next to the hobos, but they were separate and distinct group. I mean, these European immigrant miners here, the workers here that you see on the screen, they traveled by rail to these jobs, but they traveled together as a group. They usually contracted for these jobs through their ethnic labor agents, through their padrones, and they would leave their boarding house, say in Pittsburgh, travel out west, work for 4 or 5 weeks on the temporary job, get paid their wages, send 2/3 of their wages back to the old country, and then return to that same boarding house in Pittsburgh before they shipped out for another job. So they would go on the job together and they would come back together. And these guys wrote and talked in later years. I learned a lot about hobos from these immigrants who worked with them right next to them. And they would say things like this. They would say, and they used the word hobo, or they used the word American. We had a couple Americans working with us. I'm guessing that they were running away from their families or from the law or both. These immigrants assumed that these hobos were alcoholics. They were drifters, ne'er-do-wells. They were odd. They didn't come as a group. They came singly or in pairs. They often wouldn't stay for the full 5 weeks of the job. They would get paid after 2 weeks maybe and then leave. They would get into arguments with foremen all the time. They were very argumentative. They were very hard to deal with. Whereas immigrants tended to stay on the job to the end. And if they got into an argument, they would strike together, or they would stick it out to the end. But hobos were different. They had a different culture, a different whole different kind of modus operandus. The second difference between homelessness today and homelessness 100 years ago, 120 years ago, is the scale. I mean, today, I think most estimates, we don't have a really good numbers on this, believe it or not. It's amazing how poor actually our numbers on homelessness are. But today, but something like 3 million, 3.5 million Americans probably experienced homelessness in the year 2022. That's a lot of people. 3.5 million. That's 1.2% of our population, but it's nothing compared to homelessness 120 years ago. I mean, 120 years ago, having 3.5 million people homeless in a year, that was a good year. That would have been a good, and this is in a nation that was 1/5 to 1/3 the size it is today. So these numbers were enormous. This homeless world was enormous. It was an extremely common experience for white men between the Civil War and World War II. I don't do this kind of history. I don't do the number crunching, the real data, the real data analysis, but I relied on other historians who had done this data analysis and using their figures and using just a bit of figures that I collected up myself. I estimated that something between 5 to 10% of the white male population between the years 1865 and 1940 spent some time on the road homeless. 5 to 10%. This is an enormous population, a very common experience for working class men. Cities like, Chicago has to be said. Chicago was considered the hobo capital of the world. And it was on West Madison Street and that whole neighborhood. It was common for 60,000, 75,000 hobos to spend the winter on West Madison Street in the year of 1910, 1911, 1912. Just enormous population. You saw these hobos everywhere. You saw them on the streets, no matter where you lived. You saw homeless men, single homeless men walking in the streets. You saw them in the roads, you saw them in their neighborhoods. You saw them in cities. You saw them in towns. You read about them in dime novels. You read about them in newspapers. You saw them portrayed on vaudeville. The tramp and hobo character was the most commonly depicted character in American popular culture in the decades after the Civil War. It was a rich character that Americans were absolutely fascinated with. This man right here, Nat Wills, he's not a household name in America. Maybe he should be, because he was a big star, big vaudeville star, just beginning to make motion pictures before his strange and untimely death in 1915, when his Model T was in his garage, and the garage was a new thing, running, and he died of carbon monoxide poisoning. The police investigated because they suspected that his fifth wife had something to do with it, but I don't think charges were ever filed. Nat Wills died in 1915, but before he did, a young English visitor named Charlie Chaplin did see him perform and was inspired, I think, when he created his own character. But Nat Wills was a big star, and what he invented was something that we take for granted today. He invented the stand-up comedy routine. He was called a tramp monologist. He would give these monologues, much like I'm doing now, except his were funny, joke after joke after joke after joke. And the reason what made Nat Wills and what made the Tramp such a rich and absorbing character, you could do so much with it, is because these men weren't really homeless in the way we think about it today. I think we think of homeless as, not having adequate or permanent or anything like, adequate shelter of one's own. By that definition, these guys weren't homeless. They had shelter. They had homes. They were lodging houses. They were cheap hotels, working men's hotels. That every town had these. These were men's hotels. Every town had a strip, right, usually near the railroad yard, near access roads, where there were a series of hotels and services for hobos. They were called working class hotels, working men's hotels. They had shelter, they had homes, they had jobs. They would travel for those jobs and then come back. I mean, the way that the pattern of travel wasn't just kind of hit the road and wander job to job to job, although that did happen during times of depression. It was more of a hub and spoke kind of pattern of travel. They would go from, say, West Madison Street in Chicago. They would go to a labor agency like this one, contract for a job, head out to the job, work the job, and then when the job ended or when they got paid or when they quit, they would come back to West Madison Street, often staying in the same hotel that they'd stayed in before, sometimes in the very same room that they had stayed in before. They might winter over if they had enough money in their pockets and wait to go out for the next season, or they might head back out. So these guys had shelter, they had homes, they had jobs, they had money, and they spent the money. Here's a great map drawn by Nels Anderson, a great sociologist who studied the hobo better and more than anybody else, Chicago school sociologist. He did this map of West Madison Street, and you could see the cheap barber shops and cigar stores and clothing stores that were in these cheap hotel neighborhoods. And these cheap hotel neighborhoods they came to be called in later years, Skid Row. Skid Row, that term comes actually from Seattle, from the Pioneer Square Skid Road, where the timber would come to be skidded to the sawmills. But in the heyday of the hobo, these neighborhoods weren't called Skid Row. They were called the main stem. These were vibrant commercial neighborhoods where money circulated, where men went to bars, they went to cigar stores, they went to cafeterias and bookstores, they went to brothels, the gambling dens. I mean, these were attractions for men, mostly working class men, who had come to these neighborhoods for these commercial services. These were vibrant districts, and that's what made them problematic, is that they weren't down and out districts. They were vibrant districts. They were attracting the interest and the money of kind of housed men. And there was a certain romance of the main stem, and young teenage boys would go down to their main stem and they would kind of look up at these swaggering hobos, especially out west, and look at them like they were kind of like independent cowboy kind of figures. Charles Ashley wrote, he wrote this of he was a 16-year-old boy who went to the Gateway District in Minneapolis. That was the Minneapolis main stem. And he said, the hobos had their own swagger and debonair humor, so different from the farmers I knew. There was an atmosphere of recklessness and daring about these fellows who strolled along in the streets in their blue overalls or khaki trousers with gray or blue shirts open at the throat and their black slouch hats. And here's a picture of Joe Hill, hobo, Western hobo, who exemplified the kind of like the swaggering independence, kind of the cool customer air that hobos had. They were, and they belonged. What Charles Ashley was describing was a counterculture that existed on the main stem, and it was a counterculture I analyze in Citizen Hobo, and that I call Hobohemia. And it's, Hobohemia was a counterculture with its own world, its own world, its own jargon and its own values and its own, language and practices and ethics, and had its own newspaper, the Hobo News. If you're from Chicagoland, you may be familiar with the Hobo News, the Hobo College. These were things all around West Madison Street, near North Side, bookstores and things like that. This is a counterculture that's existing in tension against the dominant, we could call it middle class culture of the age. This is a subculture that also had its own union, several different unions, but by far the most powerful one was the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. Employers said that IWW stood for I won't work. And the IWW was a very, very left-wing, radical, revolutionary labor union that worked very hard in the years before World War I to organize hobo laborers, to get them to join up, and hobos were happy to do it for the most part. They would join the IWW, they would get a little red card, and that little red card, you would travel through the West. There was hardly a harvest worker on the Great Plains that didn't carry a little red card. And sometimes you would have your red card and you'd ask, if you saw another hobo on a boxcar, you'd ask them to produce it. And if they didn't have their red card, they either paid their dues or they were out, so very powerful. The IWW just kind of like took over Hobohemia in the 5 or 6 years before World War I. They went to Chicago, they went to Seattle, they went to San Francisco, and they would give lectures, and they would, recruit members. They would kind of, here's a soapbox speaker kind of encouraging the overthrow of capitalism through the IWW. They had their own newspapers, the Industrial Worker, in which they propagated a folklore of the hobo. They're the ones, the IWW, more than any other organization, promoted this idea of the hobo not as a lost, homeless soul that must be saved, but as a great, independent, revolutionary leader. In fact, it's the Western hobo, the IWW said, that is going to liberate the East from its settled domestic, life of miserable wage earning. Here is a great cartoon from the Industrial Worker, drawn by a hobo, of the harvest spirit, the Western harvest spirit, marching in his wooden shoes for the Eastern, to organize the Eastern industries. Hobos, the IWW, this folklore of the hobo kind of celebrated or valorized, valorized kind of leisure. They were against the work ethic. That the idea was that the work ethic, that's capitalism way of enslaving you to the job, and they would encourage workers, work to get as much money as you need to live, and then quit. That's the idea. You try to live as much as you can without work, because then you'll be free. The main culture, the dominant culture, celebrated the new nuclear family. Hobos were very much against that. They settled family life was just another way to enslave you to the job, enslave you to the boss. They rejected home and family life. They came up with they're the ones who started calling wives balls and chains. The old ball and chain, that was something that a hobo would not want to acquire. They were against getting and spending, this ethic of acquisitism that capitalism promoted. Here's Joe Hill cartoon here that was in the Industrial Worker. You can see he's a migratory worker chasing a young woman on a unicycle who's dangling a pork chop in front of him, and he's chasing after it. And this is a comment as a socialist who Joe Hill is criticizing. Hey lads, stay in one place and vote the socialist ticket. It's the grocery store, the working man's friend. The grocery store is just trying to kind of get the worker to settle down and become a compliant slave in the capitalist system. And this cartoon is encouraging the migratory worker to stop chasing it, but just lay off work when you can. Don't chase what would become known as the American dream. The apotheosis, or maybe the greatest artifact, the most enduring artifact of Hobohemia, is no doubt this wonderful song, Hallelujah, I'm a Bum. It was a song that was first recorded, apparently scribbled on the walls of a Kansas City jail cell, discovered in 1897. It would later make it into the Little Red Songbook, which was the IWW songbook. The IWW would raise money by selling that songbook on street corners. And I don't know if anybody in the audience is old enough to remember the song. I'm not, but I've certainly listened to it many a time. Eventually, Harry Mack McClintock McClintock, Haywire Mac McClintock, who had a radio show that was very popular in the 1920s and who had been a hobo. He recorded the song. He claimed copyright to it. And it would go, why don't you work like other men do? Well, how can I work when the skies are so blue? Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give me a handout. Revive me again. And hobos would just make up lyrics, and some were more cutting, some were more innocent. But for every person who ever sang this song, there's probably a lyric for every person who ever sang it. Why don't I save all the money I earn? Well, if I didn't eat, I'd have money to burn. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give me a handout. Revive me again. This was the song that expressed the hobohemia ethic, the countercultural ethic. And as you could imagine, there was all kinds of hand-wringing among social reformers and sociologists and politicians and reformers of all types who worried about this rising generation of native-born white American men who were not settling down into stable family units. This was a problem. This was race suicide. This was the people who were settling down and having families were these non-white immigrants. They were black sharecroppers in the South. They were having large families, but these white men, these native-born white men, are hitting the road. How do we resettle these men? This became the problem, and there are 101,001 books written on this subject. These are just a few of them. What do we do? How do we deal with this problem? They never came up with a solution, I have to say. They never did. There were all kinds of solutions to the problem, but it wasn't the reformers who brought an end to hobohemia. It was the employers, with a little help from the federal government. In 1917, when the United States entered World War I, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, very prominently opposed U.S. entry into the war. And the Justice Department cracked down on them hard, raided IWW halls around the country, and snuffed the organization out in the matter of a few months during 1917, 1918. But it was really the employers who moved on from hobo labor. They simply stopped employing hobo labor, and they did it through a variety of means. One big method was introducing all kinds of new labor-saving machinery, trucks and steam shovels and bulldozers and things that hadn't existed before, including especially the harvest combine. I mean, the harvest combine, according to one report, displaced 150,000 hobo laborers from the Great Plains within the matter of a few years in the 1920s. The harvest combine in the years after World War I just took over the Great Plains. And so hobo laborers, who were hard to deal with anyhow, farmers didn't like dealing with these guys who just would, be huffy and, leave at the drop of a hat, or they were, wobblies or IWW members. The harvest combine solved those problems. Even bigger than the harvest combine was the automobile, which of course displaced over time railroads, but it also meant that it gave a new possibility for employers, for farmers, to hire, instead of single men or gangs of men, Mexican families that they could. They found that Mexican American and Mexican immigrant families tended to be more compliant, tended not to strike, tended to work. They worked for lower wages, and because these workers had, whole families would work, and also because the breadwinner would have a family with him, he'd be more compliant on the job. That was the idea. So cheap automobiles were allowing these, poor Mexican families to start working harvest fields in the West, especially in California, but also elsewhere. But as it turns out, after a while, Mexican families began to cause trouble too. And so eventually farmers would move on in the 1930s, is getting ahead of the story a little bit, to poor white people from the Great Plains, Okies, the so-called Okies from Oklahoma. You could see they would travel for, thousands of miles in their jalopies with everything they had, move to often, Imperial Valley, Central Valley, California, and start working crops there. You could see it. You could see the transition captured in this wonderful 1930s photograph of a sign in faded Spanish here on the left and the new updated English here on the right that just encapsulates this shift from one form of labor to another. And then it was the Okies that would give this new iconic face to homelessness eventually in the 1930s. And I just thought I'd take, again, we're jumping ahead of myself a little bit here, but this is such a wonderful photo, such a famous, iconic photo taken by Dorothea Lange in 1936. The woman's name was Florence Thompson. She was from Oklahoma. She was part Cherokee Indian. She had migrated. Her husband had died. She had children and faced had stopped at a pea pickers camp, found that there were 2,500 other people waiting for a job at the pea pickers camp, and didn't know how she was going to feed her family. Dorothea Lange would later write, "I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember that she asked me no questions. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. I did not ask her name or her history. She told me her age, that she was 32. She said she had been living off frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children had killed. She had just sold the tires from her car to buy food. There she sat in that lean-to tent with her children huddled around her and seemed to know that my pictures might help her. So she helped me. There was a sort of equality about it." And here's that picture of the lean-to tent and the migrant mother, Florence Thompson, in it. She would go on to live and would go on to settle down as a Okie in California. Here she is in later age. She would die in 1983. Should be identified in the 1970s, discovered, I should say, by a reporter in the 1970s who took this photograph. Those are her wonderful daughters. She was truly a fascinating and important person. I think there should be a book written about her, but that's a whole nother story. In the 1920s, as hobos were displaced in the labor fields of the West, scholars from the University of Chicago and elsewhere began to encourage their graduate students to go out and interview these hobos. These hobos have their own songs, they have their own jargon, they have their own, style. I mean, we need to capture it before they're all gone. Everybody could see that the main stems were aging. They were becoming more like Skid Rows, where with aging hobos that weren't going on the job anymore, that were, just kind of living a subsistence or subsistence life. And one scholar at the University of Oklahoma said, hobos are an anachronism bound for extinction. That was the idea, that we've got to get out there in 1926, 1928, 1929, capture the world of the hobo, because the world of homelessness is disappearing forever. And then came the Great Depression. Turns out homelessness didn't disappear. With the Great Depression, it revived Hobohemia, or at least a version of it. It dwarfed any kind of homelessness, anything we called homelessness that had ever happened, including the long depression of the 19th century. We don't have good figures exactly on how many people were what we might call homeless in the worst years of the Great Depression, 1932, 1933. There was one census, very rudimentary census done on a series of nights in early 1933 that found that 1.5 million Americans did not spent the night without any shelter. That's about 3 times the number that spent the night without shelter tonight in America. So it's an enormous number of people. And that was just an estimate. One business that was booming was the cheap hotel, the men's hotel business, the working class hotel business. It was very hard to get a room during the Great Depression because so many people were there. And not only that, but it seemed like these homeless men were morphing into something dangerous and militant, kind of like the IWW, but a little different. They were marching on Washington. They were protesting. They were demanding things. In January 1932, 25,000 people with Father James Coxey marched on Washington from Pittsburgh, demanding, relief. In the summer of 1932, 25,000 World War I veterans marched on Washington as part of the bonus march, demanding an early payment of a bonus that had been owed them for their service in the Great War. This was all frightening, scary, that there might be, a mob revolution in the future, and that the homeless men might be leading the way. So when Franklin Roosevelt came into office in March 1933, one of the first things he did was to address this floating army out in the country. His Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the FERA, one of the first things it addressed was the problem of what it called transiency, this problem of families, but especially men kind of moving about the country in unprecedented numbers. The Federal Transient Bureau is not a New Deal agency that gets much attention. It should. It's fascinating. It really is important if you're a graduate student out there, or somebody who wants to be a historian. This is a very good topic to study. The Federal Transient Administration, the Federal Transient Program, Federal Transient Bureau really did important work building very hastily shelters around the country at node points, at collection points where homeless men especially were passing through. Here's very creative. You can see this is in Tampa, in a public park in Tampa. You have these thatch roof huts that are built by the federal government for men to live in, These are transient cabins, and there are cabins like this everywhere. They're in every, all across the country. This doesn't get a lot of attention, but the Civilian Conservation Corps does get a lot of attention. You can't find anybody today who doesn't love the Civilian Conservation Corps. You all know how divided we are as a country in terms of politics. I would think that, most liberals and conservatives love the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was highly successful. It did pull immediately 500,000 young men between the ages of 18 and 25, younger than that also, off the road, put them into camps where they were, working on public works. They would send their meager wages, most of their meager wages, home to support the family. The Civilian Conservation Corps today is very much celebrated as, it was FDR's favorite New Deal program, the Tree Army, I think he called it. But it's also kind of considered one of the most successful or celebrated New Deal programs. But at the time, it was heavily criticized. It's hard to find criticisms of it today, but at the time, it was very criticized. And what it said was, and I think it was kind of right, is, what? The Transient Bureau, the Civilian Conservation Corps, all they're really doing is replicating with federal tax dollars the hobo jungle, the hobo camps. They're creating hobo camps. They're paying hobo laborers to hobos to live together in this congregate form of living with other men, not settling down, not having families. And so it was because of this criticism that FDR, one of the reasons that he shifted in 1935 to the second New Deal, which the focus of which was in part the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. And the focus of the Works Progress Administration was to resettle family breadwinners. It was really addressing keeping at home the family breadwinner who had a family, the male who was at home with his family, keeping him at home and allowing him to maintain his position as the breadwinner and not leave home and hit the road in the first place. Another New Deal administration that didn't get a lot of attention at the time, but would later become very important, was the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration in 1936 quietly created something revolutionary, and it was the low down payment long-term, 30-year mortgage. It was before the Federal Housing Administration. To buy a house, you had to pretty much put 50% down and then pay off a loan in 3 to 5 years. The Federal Housing Administration backed loans that had low down payments with low monthly payments stretched out over 30 years and insured them. And this didn't get a lot of use at the time. It would only be, of course, after World War II, when the GI Bill adopted this model from the Federal Housing Administration and kind of transformed America, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And of course, it was the war, World War II, not the New Deal, that brought the Great Depression to the end with something close to a full employment economy as Pearl Harbor approached. And then after Pearl Harbor happened, there was all this unbelievable manpower shortage. All these, men who might have been 10 years earlier hitting the road now were working in armament shops and factories. But there was still this concern. It's interesting when you're reading the congressional record, or when you're reading what sociologists, social reformers are writing about what the war is doing to the country. There's a lot of concern about what is going to happen when we ship men overseas away from their families and they're living out, in the camp conditions, like they were on the Hobo, like they were in the CCC. And the longer the war goes on, the longer that they're, away from settled domesticity, home and family life, the harder it's going to be to resettle these men. And you get that sense in Malden cartoons, absolutely, that Willie and Joe, you don't know quite where they came from, these two dog-faced characters that Malden followed through the war. You don't know quite what their backgrounds were back in the US, but you can see now that they've kind of, they have a sweetness to them, but they've lost a kind of civility. You can imagine these two guys as hobos again, on the road. Remember that warm, soft mud last summer? And it was Malden, of course, who, after the war, he came home. He experienced firsthand the housing shortage. He saw firsthand, in the first months after the war, especially, GIs kind of sleeping on park benches. And there was this great anxiety about what is going to happen with these 12 million, mostly men, who are being discharged from the military. How are they going to be reintegrated, back into the civilian world as steady family breadwinners? And of course, that was the motive behind the GI Bill, to make sure that something like the bonus army would not happen after World War II. The GI Bill, one of the most important pieces of legislation in the past 100 years, with this extraordinary package of benefits for unemployment compensation, for education, of course, and for housing. 5% down, 30-year mortgage, making purchased homes cheaper than rented apartments. It revolutionized the American landscape. By 1960, 60% of Americans are living in their single-attached suburban family homes. And all of this really was quite jarring to somebody like a cartoonist like Bill Malden, who didn't graduate high school, who had hoboed himself in the 1930s, whose characters, Willie and Joe, you can imagine before the war, they were hobos. And then in the war, they become, infantry dog faces. And then afterwards, they are now steady family breadwinners. Bill Malden did this cartoon in the months immediately after World War II. You can see Willie back from the war, now with a child, laden with groceries, pushing the stroller. And one of his old war buddies says, "How's it feel to be a free man, Willie?" You can tell by this cartoon that the jarring transition that had happened within the span of under 20 years was too much for Malden. And in fact, shortly after this cartoon, he stopped cartooning just because he had changed and the world had changed, and his characters didn't belong in this new world anymore. Thank you very much. That's my talk about the American hobo. I expect there are probably some questions here. I think I see some questions.
Yes, we do have some questions. Thank you so much, Todd. I also wanted to point out I saw your Dorothea Lange photo. And for those of you who do not know, the library currently has a Dorothea Lange exhibit happening. We have 30 of her original lifetime prints on display, including Migrant Mother. So come check that out now at the library. We do have a couple questions, so I will read those to you. The first one, when hobos traveled west to work those temporary jobs for about a 4 to 5 week period of time, how were they able to find shelter? Where did they live while out west?
Bunkhouses. The companies would build temporary bunkhouses where the workers would live. And they would cram into really crowded bunkhouses and live there until the job was done and then ship back.
Okay. On average, how much education did the hobos have? Could they read?
What a great question. Yes, they could. There was high literacy rates among hobos. It's really interesting. Hobos tended to come from not the poorest Americans, believe it or not. The very poorest Americans really didn't move much at all. Hobos had to have something to kind of, they'd usually start out with a little bit of money that might start them on the road. So they tended to be people who had some kind of at least rudimentary education. They were working class. And this was a routine thing that, there were lots of people who would later become famous who spent time on the road. Supreme Court Justice, whose name, maybe one of you, gosh, how do I not know his name? It'll come to me.
Okay.
I'll Google it.
Let's see. Another question. What happened to the hobo when he became too old to work intermittently?
Love that question because it reminds me that I didn't emphasize something that I should have, which was that most hobos spent very little time on the road. Most of the people on the road spent under a year traveling. Often it was 5 weeks, 3 months. It was a stage in the life cycle, kind of like, my younger daughter's 22, graduated college, and she's working in Madrid for a year. It's kind of like a stage in the life cycle, a little adventure that she's having.
Mm-hmm.
This would be something that working class boys, teenagers, 16, 18-year-old kids would do as kind of like part of growing up. They would see a little bit of the world. They would earn some money. They would circulate. They would do a lot of other things. And then they would come back home and settle down. That was usually the pattern. The ones who stayed on the road, the ones who made a life on the main stem, Skid Row, they were kind of different. And people understood that they probably had different motives, maybe. Maybe there was mental illness there. Maybe there was substance abuse. There was the Hobohemia overlapped with the urban gay subculture in the early 20th century. So that may have been, part of the appeal for older men who stayed in that milieu. So that's a wonderful question, but most went in and out of the subculture, and it kind of like it had their impact on them for the rest of their lives. But the ones who aged on Skid Row tended really to do very low paid common labor in the neighborhoods where they lived.
Our next one is just a comment that they had learned the song that you sang. They learned that in the middle 1950s in camp, but never knew what the song meant.
Isn't that great? And you may have also sang the Big Rock Candy Mountain. That was another hobo
Yes,
song.
I'm familiar with that one.
Yeah, that's here's an assignment for all of yins, as we say in Pittsburgh. Go look up the original lyrics to the Big Rock Candy Mountain. You can see what it's really all about.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Our next one, in the Great Depression photo of the really long line of people taken from above, were they standing in line for food or jobs or both?
Great question. Let's take a look at that. I don't have an answer to it. This is something that we as presenters do, I think, with not enough care. And that is, we use images to illustrate, to set a mood, to illustrate a point, without knowing much often about the illustration. And so when I get a question like that, it reminds me, you know what, Todd, maybe take a little bit more care, seriously, about what you're showing, because they may be lining up to see a movie,
right?
Yeah. But let's see. I don't know what they're lining up for. I'm guessing it's food.
Okay.
That's what I'm guessing. But that's a wonderful question. Thank you for that correction.
Have you ever been to the National Hobo Convention in Britt, Iowa?
I have, twice.
What is that?
Stephanie, it's the National Hobo Convention. I mean, what?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You have not been there? I mean,
of course.
Yeah, it is the National Hobo Convention is like this great camp out. It's this great celebration of the hobo. There's a hobo parade. Britt, Iowa is a tiny town in Iowa, north central Iowa, I think. And so there were in the early 1900s, 1901 even, a couple of the town promoters decide, like, we're going to promote boosters. We're going to promote Britt, Iowa by having the National Hobo Convention. And people come dressed as hobos, these Emmett Kelly characters, Nat Wills kind of characters. It was like this big gag. And it was revived then every once in a while. And I think every year there's been a National Hobo Convention since the 1970s. And people come, thousands of people come from all over the country. There's a lot of song. There's a lot of mulligan stew, and it's a heck of a lot of fun.
Nice. Our next question: are there still hobos in today's world?
Great question. Yeah, there are. It's a dangerous world. I mean, if you're talking hobos, there are a lot of hobo equivalent worlds. But if you're actually talking about people who are riding the rails, if you monitor the New York Times long enough, you will see that like every 12 years, they do a major story on the new generation of hobos. So there'll be punks or there'll be anarchists.
Right.
There are young people who kind of are dedicated to, living without work, living on the margins, on the edges of capitalist civilization. And they ride the rails. But it's a dangerous world. Riding trains is very, very dangerous for so many reasons. But yeah, it's kind of one of those things where I think it'll always exist in some form.
And then I have a question for you. When we were promoting this program and we were thinking about what to call it, we had an internal talk about if we were allowed to use the word hobo and if that was derogatory.
That is, yeah. And you know what? That's another thing I didn't emphasize, and I really should have. The word hobo, when Jack London used it, when an ordinary person would use it in, say, the year 1910, it was an honorific. These guys called themselves hobo.
Okay.
They were proud of it. It meant that they weren't a tramp and they weren't a bum. A hobo works and wanders, a tramp drinks and wanders, and a bum just drinks. That was like the joke.
Right.
And so it was an appellation of pride for men. Sometime by 1930, hobo begins to be used as a term for any homeless poor man.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, like, in other words, a guy said to me, he was missing a tooth. A tooth came out, and he said, "I'm embarrassed to go out. I look like a hobo." And I thought, should I correct him about that?
Right.
Hobos had teeth.
Right.
So, yeah, but it's a great question.
All right. Very nice. Well, that concludes all of our questions for this evening. So thank you, Todd, and thank you to all of our patrons for coming out. That was super informative. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Stephanie. And thank you all for listening to me gab.
All right.